I never imagined that one day I would sit down and peel open the wounds I spent a lifetime concealing. My habit and veil may cover me now, but beneath these layers of cloth and prayer lies a story that has haunted every breath of my existence. Silence was once my companion, a heavy blanket I wrapped around myself so that no one would know the truth. But silence, my dear listener, is not peace. It is a prison, and I lived within it for far too long. I was never supposed to be here, speaking about things I once vowed I would take to my grave. I always thought that if I just buried the past deep enough, time would erase it. Time never erases, time only waits, circling like a patient shadow until the day we are forced to face it. That day has come for me, and if I tremble as I speak, it is because I know the truth I am about to reveal is not just my own. It is the story of a woman who was stripped of her dignity, her strength, and her freedom by the very person she gave life to. People see me now as Sister Charlotte, a woman of God who walks with calm steps and speaks with a measured voice. But before I wore these garments, before I took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, I was simply Charlotte Reeves, a mother who loved her child more than life itself. That love was pure, unconditional, and blinding, and it was turned against me in ways I could never have foreseen. I remember the early years when my home was filled with laughter, the small sounds of a child's feet running down the hallway, the innocence of bedtime prayers whispered under a quilt. In those moments, I believed I had done something right, that my son and I would carry each other through life. But those tender days were only the calm before a storm that would stretch across a decade and leave scars I still trace with my fingers when the night grows too long. It did not happen all at once. Evil rarely does. It seeps in like a draft through a cracked window, chilling the air 1 degree at a time, until suddenly you realize you are frozen. My son's dominance began with words, sharp, dismissive, commanding. At first, I dismissed them as the arrogance of youth, the stubbornness of a boy testing his boundaries. I told myself, he'll grow out of it. But what he grew into was not a man of kindness or respect. He grew into my captor. There are those who will ask, how could a mother allow such a thing? How could she not stop it? And to them I have no neat answer. I was alone. I was vulnerable. And most of all, I was bound by a chain that is invisible but unbreakable, a mother's love. I wanted to believe there was goodness in him, that he was simply lost, that if I prayed enough, endured enough, he would change. But love twisted into fear, and fear twisted into submission. It began with small demands, fetch this, clean that, obey without question. Soon the house became less a home and more a prison. My hands worked endlessly, cooking, scrubbing, carrying out his every command. I was no longer his mother. I was his servant, and in those days I felt a shame so sharp it cut deeper than any wound. To admit that my own child had turned me into a slave was to admit that I had failed in the one role society told me I must succeed in, being a mother. I learned to wear masks. To neighbors, I was polite, smiling, offering greetings that sounded warm but tasted like ash in my mouth. To the parish, I was devoted, kneeling in prayer and singing hymns with a voice that trembled from exhaustion. And to myself, in the mirror of each morning, I was nothing. A shell, a shadow, a woman who could not recognize the eyes staring back at her. I must confess that in those years, I often asked God a question that startled even me. Why did you give me life, if only to let it be consumed by the one I brought into this world? Faith is supposed to steady the soul. But in those moments, my faith was a thin thread fraying under the weight of despair. Still, I clung to it, because when every other bond is poisoned, the bond with God is all that remains. The silence grew heavier as the years passed. Each day bled into the next, and though I longed to cry out, to beg for help, the fear of humiliation and disbelief shackled my voice. Who would believe that a son could do this to his mother? Who would not look at me with disgust or pity? So I chose silence. But silence has a cost, and mine was my spirit slowly unraveling. It was during those darkest hours that I began to write secret prayers in the margins of my Bible. I could not say the words aloud, so I carved them onto paper. Lord, see me. Lord, deliver me. Lord, do not let me die in this prison of my own home. They were desperate words, fragile words, but they kept me alive. Now, after so many years, I speak them aloud for the first time, not as pleas, but as testimony. My journey through those 10 years of captivity was not just survival. It was the crucible in which my faith was tested, broken, and remade. And though my voice quivers, I know I must tell it, for stories kept in darkness only feed the shadows. Stories spoken in truth can set someone free. So if you are listening to me now, know that you are hearing not just the story of Sister Charlotte Reeves, but the story of a woman who once thought escape was impossible, who once thought God had turned his face away. I will take you with me into that house where love was twisted into bondage, into the silence that nearly destroyed me, and into the night when I finally found the courage to step beyond those walls. This is not an easy story. It is not gentle or sweet, but it is mine. And by telling it, I reclaim what was stolen. My name is Charlotte Reeves, and this is the burden I carried in silence. When I close my eyes and reach back to the earliest memories, I do not see chains or shadows. I see sunlight spilling across wooden pews, the smell of candles in a small-town parish, and the sound of hymns carried on voices stronger than my own. My childhood was painted in warm tones. Sundays meant polished shoes, braided hair, and the steady hand of my mother guiding me through the crowd of worshippers. My father, though stern, had a laugh that could lift an entire room. Ours was a life of modest means, but simple joys. Family dinners where we bowed our heads in prayer, evenings spent shelling peas on the porch, summers running through tall grass that kissed our knees. Faith was never forced upon me. It was absorbed, like sunlight into skin. From an early age, I felt the nearness of God in ordinary things, in the call of birds at dawn, in the silence of snow covering our roof, in the hush of prayer whispered before bed. My teachers often said I had a quiet seriousness for a girl so young. But beneath that seriousness was a longing, to love deeply, to care for others, to build a family bound not by perfection, but by devotion. Life moved swiftly, as it often does when youth blinds us to time's sharp edges. I grew, I studied, and I dreamed of what lay beyond our little town. I believed, as many young women did, that happiness would arrive on the day I wore white and spoke vows of love before an altar. When that day came, I felt as though my prayers had been answered. The man I married was not perfect, none of us are, but in his arms I thought I had found a safe harbor. Our wedding was small, simple, and fragrant with roses clipped from neighbors' gardens. We had little money, but what we lacked in wealth we believed we made up for in hope. I walked down that aisle believing I was stepping into a life of mutual respect and partnership. I did not know then how fragile vows can become when tested by the storms of pride and sin. In the beginning, marriage felt like the promise fulfilled. We moved into a small house with creaking floors and windows that let in too much winter wind. But it was ours. I poured myself into homemaking, quilts stitched by hand, bread baked on Saturday mornings, prayers whispered over the bed we shared. My heart swelled the first time I felt the faint kick of life within me. Motherhood was a dream I had carried since childhood, and when my son arrived, that dream seemed more real than anything I had ever touched. I can still remember holding him for the first time. His tiny fists curled around my finger, his breaths shallow and quick. I thought, this child is my purpose, this child is my gift. Every cry, every restless night, every fever that made me kneel at his bedside, I welcomed them all. Because motherhood, in those early years, was an offering of love so pure, I thought it could never sour. But time has a way of carving truth into stone. My husband grew distant, his affection slipping away like sand through fingers. He sought solace outside our home, leaving me to cradle not only the weight of our child, but also the heavy silence of abandonment. When he finally left for good, the house echoed with absence. I was young, far too young, and the responsibility was crushing. Yet I told myself I would endure. For my son, I would endure anything. Those who saw me in church with my little boy praised my devotion. Such a strong mother, they would whisper. I smiled politely, clutching his hand tighter, hiding the tremor of exhaustion. They did not know the tears I shed when the lamps were out, when only God bore witness to my unraveling strength. I lived for him. I bent my life into shapes to protect him, provide for him, and ensure he never felt the sting of his father's absence. I wanted him to grow believing he was loved beyond measure, and for a time, I thought I had succeeded. He was clever, bright-eyed, curious about the world. He asked questions that made me laugh, tested rules like all children do, and looked at me with eyes that seemed to say, "You are my everything." How was I to know that same gaze would one day harden into something cold and cruel? Looking back, I see the cracks that were forming. Small cruelties disguised as jokes, demands hidden beneath playful tones, a growing impatience that unsettled me, though I could not name why. I excused them, told myself boys were rough, that adolescence sharpened tempers but dulled in time. I prayed over him nightly, asking God to guide his steps, never daring to imagine those steps would one day trample over my dignity. In those days, I clung to faith more than ever. Each sunrise was a reminder that I was not entirely alone. I taught my son to kneel beside me, to fold his hands and speak simple prayers. He repeated the words, his small voice rising beside mine. If only prayers could anchor a heart against what would come. My family, my neighbors, even the parish believed we were doing well, a mother and son surviving against the odds. They saw resilience, but they did not see the fractures beneath. For I was weary, bone-deep weary, and though I smiled, my soul trembled with an unease I could not yet name. If innocence is a garden, mine was still blooming in those years of young motherhood. I had not yet tasted the bitterness of betrayal from within my own household. I still believed love could shield us, that sacrifice was enough to shape a child into a man of compassion. I held fast to that belief, even as shadows began to lengthen. And then came the first moment, the faintest signal, that everything I trusted was beginning to twist. I remember it with painful clarity. A look in his eyes, sharper than any word. A command spoken not with respect, but with entitlement. It was small, almost forgettable, but deep in my chest, something shifted. I brushed it aside, convincing myself it was nothing. But I would come to see it as the first gust of a storm that would rage for 10 long years. That evening, as I tucked him into bed, I whispered the same blessing I always had. May the Lord keep you. May his face shine upon you. May you walk in his ways. He closed his eyes, but the weight of that day lingered in my heart. My garden of innocence was beginning to wither, and I did not yet know that the roots of sorrow had already begun to grow. It is strange the way cruelty sneaks into a home. It does not arrive with banners or thunder. It tiptoes, disguises itself as ordinary moods, slips beneath the fabric of daily life until one day you realize the air itself has changed. That was how it began with my son, the same child I once cradled against my chest, the same boy whose laughter filled my small kitchen, began to speak with a tone that chilled me. His words were no longer questions or innocent remarks. They were commands. At first I did not notice. A mother is often blind to the faults of her child. When he demanded that I fetch him a glass of water rather than asking politely, I told myself it was just a phase. When he ordered me to clean his room instead of helping me as he once did, I excused it as youthful stubbornness. I did not see the cracks forming, though they were plain. My heart would not allow me to believe my son could turn against me. But over time, the changes grew sharper, like a blade honed in secret. He no longer asked me to prepare meals, he demanded them, and if they were late, his anger flared. He no longer helped with chores, but instead sat back and watched, as though my labor was owed to him. And each time I resisted, even gently, his eyes hardened in ways that made me tremble. I told myself I was strong enough to handle it. I told myself it was temporary. Mothers are skilled at lying to themselves when the truth threatens to shatter their hearts. I whispered. He is only testing boundaries. He will outgrow this. But what he grew into was not a man of kindness. It was something else, something darker. There came a day when the shift became undeniable. I had been working since morning, scrubbing the floors until my hands were raw, preparing food with the little we had. I sat down at last to rest my back when he entered and ordered me to rise. His tone was not playful. It was sharp, cold, final. He looked at me, not as a son looks at his mother, but as a master looks at a servant. I froze. 1,000 memories of his first steps, his first words, The joy of his small arms wrapped around me clashed with the cruelty in his voice. My heart broke in that instant, though I said nothing. From that day forward, the pattern was set. He commanded, I obeyed. If I hesitated, his words cut sharper. If I protested, his anger grew like a fire. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, my role shifted. I was no longer mother. I was servant. It is difficult to explain the shame of such a transformation. I had survived abandonment by my husband, had endured loneliness, had provided for my child against the odds. Yet now I was reduced to a shadow within my own home. I told myself I endured for love, but love had turned into chains. Every act of service felt less like devotion and more like captivity. Still I submitted, because I could not bear the thought of abandoning him, as his father had abandoned us both. The neighbors saw nothing. When they passed by, I smiled, waved, spoke of ordinary things. At church, I sang hymns, my voice steady though my spirit trembled. No one knew the darkness that had begun to consume my days. My silence protected him even as his commands hollowed me. And in that silence, I began to lose myself. There were moments when I caught glimpses of the boy I once knew, the way he laughed at a story, the way his brow furrowed in thought. Those moments broke me more than the cruelty. They reminded me that he had once been innocent, that somewhere beneath the hardness was the child I loved. But those moments became rarer until I could no longer tell if they were real or only illusions I clung to. One evening stands out in my memory like a scar that never fades. I had spent the day washing clothes in scalding water, my hands blistered, my back aching. He returned home and found one shirt not pressed to his satisfaction. His voice rose, sharp as a whip. I stood there trembling, clutching the fabric, and for the first time I felt fear. Not the fear of discipline or disappointment, but the fear that I was truly no longer safe in my own house. That night, as I lay in bed, I stared at the ceiling and realized the truth I had avoided. My son had become my master. I prayed harder than ever in those days. My prayers shifted from gratitude to desperation. Lord, give me strength. Lord, remind me I am still yours. Lord, help me to endure without losing my soul. The pages of my Bible became damp with tears, my whispered petitions rising like smoke from a fire about to burn out. People might ask, why did you not leave? Why did you not call for help? But such questions misunderstand the power of love twisted by fear. I could not abandon him. I could not expose him, for to do so felt like betraying him. My identity was bound up in being his mother. If I ceased to serve him, who was I? If I spoke against him, what would become of him? And so I remained, shackled not by walls or locks, but by the chains of devotion and silence. The cruelty grew, little by little, until it became the air I breathed. My days blurred into an endless cycle of labor, commands, and quiet sobs in the corners where he could not see. Yet even then I clung to hope. Hope that God saw me, hope that somehow this was a trial with meaning, hope that one day he would remember I was his mother and not his slave. But hope can be as heavy as despair. It weighed on me until my back bent under it, and still I carried it, because letting it go would mean admitting the life I had built was broken beyond repair. That was the season when love truly turned into chains. Chains I could not see but could feel with every command, every insult, every act of submission. And though I longed to believe they would one day loosen, I was only sinking deeper into their grip. There comes a moment when the walls of your own house no longer feel like protection, but like bars. For me, that realization came slowly, like dawn breaking on a bleak horizon. My home, once a place of comfort and laughter, had transformed into a cage where every step, every word, every breath felt monitored by the son I once carried in my arms. The routines he imposed on me grew harsher with each passing year. From sunrise until the small hours of the night, my hands were never idle. I scrubbed the floors until my knuckles cracked and bled. I cooked elaborate meals I never ate. I washed and ironed clothes until the steam stung my eyes and left my skin raw. Nothing I did was ever enough. If the soup was not seasoned to his liking, his words cut deeper than knives. If his shirt was not pressed to perfect lines, his temper flared like fire. I began to move through the house with the silence of a shadow, careful not to disturb him. I knew the creak of every board in the floor, the exact way to close a door without sound, the precise measure of water to pour into his cup. My life was reduced to calculations of survival. It was not just physical labor that chained me, it was humiliation. He spoke to me as though I were less than human, as though my only purpose in life was to serve him. When neighbors came, he painted a mask of charm, speaking kindly, even smiling. But as soon as the door closed, the mask fell, and I was reminded of my place, beneath him, voiceless, invisible. I told myself I endured for the sake of peace, for the hope that tomorrow might be better. But peace never came, and tomorrow always brought the same commands, the same cruelty. My spirit began to fracture under the weight. There was one evening I will never forget. I had worked from dawn, carrying heavy baskets of laundry, scrubbing each garment until my muscles ached. When he returned home, he found a single shirt folded imperfectly. His rage was swift. He hurled it at me, his words sharp and degrading. I stumbled back, not from the cloth but from the realization that I no longer recognized him. Where was the boy I had sung to sleep? Where was the child who once clung to my hand in church? Gone, replaced by a man who looked at me as though I were property. The exhaustion seeped deeper than my body. It reached my soul. At night, I would collapse on the thin mattress in my room, too weary even to cry. Yet sleep never brought peace. I dreamed of chains binding my wrists, of endless hallways where I wandered searching for a door that never appeared. I woke each morning with a heaviness that prayer alone could not lift. Still, I prayed. My Bible became my closest confidant. Its pages absorbed my tears, its verses my lifeline. I read of Israel's slavery in Egypt and felt my heart ache with recognition. I read of Paul's letters from prison and thought, yes, I too am imprisoned. The words gave me comfort, yet also deepened my despair, for I wondered why God allowed me to live this way. Was I being punished? Was this my cross to bear? The physical toll was undeniable. My body weakened. My back bent from constant labor. My hands blistered and scarred. One afternoon, while scrubbing the kitchen floor, my vision blurred, and I collapsed. For a moment, I thought it was the end. Perhaps death had come as release. But when I opened my eyes, I was still in that same prison, still bound by his voice calling my name, demanding I rise and finish my work. It was in that collapse that I realized how invisible I had become, even to myself. I was no longer Charlotte, the woman who once dreamed, who once hoped. I was simply the servant of my son, existing to meet his demands. My name, my identity, my very soul felt erased, and yet, beneath the despair, a small ember remained. When I collapsed, I remember whispering, "Lord, do not let me die like this. See me, hear me." That whisper was faint, but it was the first sign that I still longed for something more than survival. The prison of my home had thick walls, but I began to sense that escape was not only physical, it was spiritual. If I could find a way to reclaim even a fragment of my dignity, perhaps I could begin to see a path forward. But for now, that path remained hidden, buried beneath years of fear and silence. Still, each day I rose again, carried out the chores, and endured his cruelty. My body weakened, but my prayers deepened. And though the walls of that house closed in around me, I began to believe, just faintly, that God had not turned his face entirely away. Silence is not the absence of sound. Silence is the presence of fear, sitting heavy on your chest until you can scarcely breathe. That was the silence I lived in, a silence that bound my tongue more tightly than any rope could. My home, my prison, was full of unspoken words that rattled in my mind like stones in a jar. I wanted to scream them, to pour out the truth. But each time my lips parted, fear pressed them closed again. My son was clever. He knew how to wield appearances like weapons. To neighbors he was courteous, even charming. He carried groceries for the elderly, greeted families at the parish with polite nods, and offered firm handshakes. Such a fine young man, they would say. I smiled alongside them, but behind that smile was a scream they never heard. No one suspected that the very hands praised for their helpfulness were the same hands that pointed at me in command, demanding I bend to his will. He had learned to manipulate not only me, but everyone around us. If I appeared weary in public, he explained it away. My mother worries too much. If my eyes were swollen from tears, he joked, "She never sleeps enough." People laughed, nodded, and moved on. And I, bound by fear and shame, let them believe his words. Each lie built another wall around me, making escape feel ever more impossible. In private, the threats were constant. He did not need to raise his hand to make me quake. His words carried enough venom. "If you speak, no one will believe you. If you try to leave, you'll have nothing. If you defy me, you'll regret it." Those words became the bars of my cage. I swallowed them day after day until I began to wonder if perhaps he was right. Perhaps no one would believe me. My faith, once a lantern, dimmed beneath the weight of secrecy. I went to Mass, I kneeled, I prayed, but the prayers felt hollow. The hymns I sang caught in my throat. I asked God why he had given me a voice if I was too afraid to use it. I asked why he allowed me to be silenced in the very house where I once prayed over my child's crib. The heavens seemed far away, my words rising only to fall back down like ashes. And yet, somewhere deep within, I carried a fragile ember of hope. It flickered most strongly in the confessional. There were times when I nearly spoke the truth to the priest hidden behind the screen. My breath trembled as I began, "Father, I have carried a burden too heavy to bear." But fear would seize me, and I would stumble back into vague words about weakness, about doubt, about sin. Never the truth. The truth felt too monstrous, too shameful. How could I confess that the very son I bore had turned me into his servant? I lived in two worlds. By day, I was the obedient mother, fulfilling endless tasks, hiding every trace of rebellion. By night, when he slept, I was a broken woman, whispering desperate prayers into the darkness. The floor beside my bed became worn where my knees pressed night after night. I begged God to hear me, to send some sign that I was not alone. The weight of silence bore down hardest when I was forced to smile in public. I remember one Sunday vividly. After Mass, the parish women gathered around me, praising my son. "You've raised him so well, Charlotte," one said, her eyes full of admiration. I felt heat rise to my cheeks, not from pride but from shame. They saw only the mask he wore. They did not see the cracks in my spirit, the tears that stained my pillow each night. I smiled, nodded, and felt the truth clawing at my throat like an animal desperate to escape. But again, I swallowed it down. Sometimes, in rare moments of solitude, I allowed myself to imagine speaking out. I pictured myself telling a neighbor, confiding in a priest, even whispering to a stranger. I imagined their shocked expressions, their words of comfort, their hands reaching to lift me from the shadows. But the fantasy always dissolved when reality struck. My son's threats echoed louder than hope, and so the silence remained. It is a terrible thing to live unseen. My own reflection became a stranger. I looked into the mirror and wondered who I was. Not a mother, not a woman of dignity, not even a child of God. I felt like nothing more than an echo of the person I once had been. And yet, even in that emptiness, the truth pressed against me, demanding release. One night, I held my Bible in trembling hands. I opened to the Psalms and found words that felt as though they had been written for me. "I am forgotten as though I were dead. I have become like broken pottery." Tears blurred the page. For the first time, I whispered aloud, "That is me." It was the closest I had come to confessing my truth. Not to another person, but to God himself. That moment marked a shift, though small. I realized that silence could not hold forever. Secrets rot in the dark, and mine was beginning to poison me from within. My body ached not just from labor, but from carrying the weight of what I refused to speak. My spirit was crumbling under the strain. I knew, though I could barely admit it, that one day the truth would spill out, whether by my voice or by my collapse, and collapse it nearly was. There came a night when exhaustion overcame me, and I wept so violently that I could not breathe. My body shook, my chest burned, and I thought, this is the end. My son slept in the next room, oblivious to the storm inside me. I pressed a pillow to my mouth to muffle the sound, but in that muffled cry something changed. For the first time I allowed myself to think the unthinkable. I cannot survive like this. If I do not speak, I will die in silence. That thought terrified me, but it also lit a spark. It was the faintest whisper of a hidden truth rising to the surface. I was still too afraid to reveal it, but deep within, I knew that silence had become my deadliest enemy. And the day was coming when my voice, trembling and broken as it might be, would have to be heard. There are moments in life when the smallest flicker of light can pierce even the thickest darkness. For me, that flicker came quietly, without warning, on a day that seemed like all the others. I had risen before dawn, my body aching from endless work, my spirit heavy with the silence I carried. My son barked his usual commands, and I obeyed them as I always had. But as I bent over the wash basin, scrubbing clothes until my knuckles burned, something within me shifted. I cannot explain why. Perhaps it was exhaustion, perhaps divine mercy, but in that moment I thought, this cannot be all that God intended for my life. The thought startled me. For years I had convinced myself that endurance was holiness, that obedience even to cruelty was somehow righteous. But that morning, hunched over soapy water, I began to wonder if survival itself could be sacred. If perhaps God was not asking me to endure until I perished, but to rise and live. That thought lingered like an ember. I did not yet have the courage to act, but the idea refused to die. It followed me as I scrubbed the floor, as I cooked meals I would never taste, as I ironed shirts to perfection. A whisper in my soul repeated, "You are still alive. You are still His." It was not only within myself that I began to sense change. Outside my prison, strangers sometimes offered small kindnesses that struck me more deeply than they could ever know. One afternoon, while buying a few groceries with the money my son allotted me, the cashier, a young woman with bright eyes, said softly, "You look so tired, ma'am. I hope you take care of yourself." Her words were ordinary, but they pierced me. For once, someone had seen me, not the mask, not the silence, but me. I carried those words like treasure back to my home. They reminded me that I had not completely vanished, that traces of Charlotte still existed beneath the chains. I began to notice such moments more often. A neighbor offering me extra bread, a priest's homily about courage that felt spoken directly to my heart, even a child's innocent smile as I passed by. Small signs, faint but undeniable, that God had not forgotten me. Still, the chains remained. My son's control did not lessen. His arrogance grew. He mocked me, belittled me, demanded more than ever. Yet as his cruelty deepened, so too did the ember of defiance within me. Each insult, each command, each weary day seemed to add fuel to a fire I had thought long extinguished. The turning point came one night when I overheard him boasting to a friend. He spoke of me not as a mother but as a servant, laughing as though my suffering were a joke to be shared. My heart pounded with rage and sorrow. For the first time in years, I did not cry quietly. I clenched my fists and whispered to God, "I am still your child. I am still alive." In that whisper, I felt strength stir in my bones. From then on, I began to change, not outwardly, for that would have been too dangerous, but inwardly. I started to reclaim small pieces of myself. I prayed not only for endurance, but for courage. I ate scraps in secret when he left food untouched, no longer denying myself entirely. I hummed hymns under my breath as I worked, tiny rebellions that reminded me I was more than his servant. Each act was small, but together they formed a lifeline. One evening, after finishing a long day's labor, I stood before the mirror. The woman staring back was thin, weary, scarred by years of servitude. But for the first time, I did not turn away in disgust. I looked into her eyes and thought, "You are still here. You are not gone yet." That realization filled me with a strange kind of hope. I could not leave yet. I could not speak yet. But I could believe that freedom was possible. My faith, once dim, began to brighten. I read the story of the Israelites again, but this time I did not see only their slavery. I saw their deliverance. I saw the Red Sea parting. I saw them walk into freedom by the hand of God. And I thought, if He could deliver them, He can deliver me too. Of course, fear still lingered. My son's threats had not ceased, and I knew that discovery could mean disaster. But alongside the fear grew a dangerous hope. Dangerous because it made me dream of escape. Dangerous because it made me question His power. Dangerous because it made me believe I was worth saving. I began to prepare in secret, though at first it was only in my heart. I imagined what life beyond those walls could look like. I pictured sunlight on my face without commands shouted at me. I imagined speaking my truth without trembling. These thoughts were not yet plans, but they were seeds. and seeds, once planted, have a way of breaking through even the hardest ground. One night, as I knelt beside my bed, I prayed not for endurance, but for deliverance. My voice shook as I said aloud, "Lord, give me the strength to leave when the moment comes." It was the boldest prayer I had spoken in 10 years, and in that moment I felt a strange peace settle over me, as though heaven itself was whispering back, "I hear you." That was the day my strength began to return. Not enough to break free, not yet, but enough to remind me that I was still a woman, still a mother, still a child of God. Enough to remind me that silence was not my destiny. Enough to know that one day, somehow, I would no longer bow to my son's cruelty. The chains were still there, but they no longer felt unbreakable. My prison still surrounded me, but a door, however faint, had appeared in my mind. I did not yet know when or how I would walk through it, but I knew this: I would not die in silence. Hope is a fragile thing. In the wrong hands, it can feel like a weapon waiting to be used against you. For years, I did not dare allow myself to hope, for fear that it would be crushed underfoot. But once the ember of strength returned, hope began to creep into my days like dawn creeping over a long night. It was dangerous, this hope, dangerous because it whispered of freedom, dangerous because it dared me to dream. At first, the changes were small. I began to notice opportunities where once I saw only impossibilities. When my son left the house, I paid attention to the hours he stayed away. I counted the coins he left behind and began to set aside a few, hidden carefully between the pages of my Bible. They were only pennies at first, but each one felt like a brick in a bridge I was secretly building. I also began to prepare in ways that seemed insignificant. I kept scraps of paper where I wrote short notes, reminders of courage, verses from Scripture, fragments of the life I longed for. I tucked them away in corners he would never think to look, behind loose boards, inside old hymnals, even in the lining of my coat. These secret writings were not only plans, they were proof to myself that I still had a voice. But with each act of defiance, no matter how small, the danger grew. My son had sharp eyes. He began to notice when my gaze lingered too long at the window. He questioned why I sometimes seemed distracted during my chores. One evening, he accused me of disobedience. My heart pounded as he leaned close and said, "Don't think you can outsmart me. I know everything you do." His words chilled me, but they also confirmed that he sensed the shift within me. That night, fear wrapped around me like chains, yet the ember of hope refused to die. I prayed harder than ever, whispering into the darkness, "Lord, protect me. Give me wisdom. Do not let him see what you are building inside me." My prayers were no longer for mere survival. They were for deliverance. I began to study the house as though it were both prison and map. I memorized the sound of his footsteps, the timing of his returns, the way the locks worked on the doors. I noted which neighbors were home at which hours, who kept a lantern burning late at night, who might hear a cry if one escaped my lips. My mind, once dulled by despair, became sharp with observation. Every detail mattered. Still, the risk was immense. If he discovered my secret savings, my hidden notes, or even the flicker of determination in my eyes, his wrath would be unbearable. I knew that one wrong step could end any chance of escape. And so I moved carefully, blending obedience with quiet rebellion, masking my hope behind the same servile smile he had grown accustomed to. There was one evening when the danger became all too real. I had hidden a small coin inside my apron pocket, intending to tuck it away later. He demanded I empty my pockets, and for a breathless moment I thought the coin would fall, exposing everything. My hands shook, my heart thundered, but by some mercy he was distracted and did not notice. When he turned away, I pressed my hand against that coin and whispered, "Thank you, Lord." That coin, worthless to anyone else, felt like a crown of victory upon my head. Hope is not always a gentle flame. Sometimes it is a raging fire that threatens to consume you. I began to dream more vividly of freedom. I pictured myself walking into a church, collapsing at the feet of a priest, finally pouring out the truth. I imagined sitting in a quiet room, sunlight streaming through a window, where no voice commanded me to rise or serve. These dreams filled me with strength, but they also sharpened the terror of being caught. One night, I woke from such a dream to find him standing in my doorway, his eyes suspicious. "What were you dreaming about?" he demanded. I stammered something about nothing at all, but his gaze lingered on me as though he could see the rebellion forming in my heart. Long after he left, I lay trembling, realizing just how dangerous hope had become. If he sensed it, if he exposed it, I might lose everything, yet even with the danger, I could not let go. Because hope once tasted is impossible to forget. It reminded me that I was not born to serve as a prisoner in my own home. It reminded me that I was still Charlotte Reeves, still a woman, still a child of God. And if I was his child, then surely he had not created me for chains. My secret preparations continued. I grew braver, though still careful. I placed small markers of courage around me. A folded note in my Bible that read, "Do not be afraid." A hymn I hummed under my breath as I worked. A glance at the door that promised one day I would walk through it. Each act was a thread, weaving together the fabric of my eventual escape. But as the threads grew stronger, so did his suspicion. He began to question me more, to watch me more closely. I knew the window of opportunity would not stay open forever. Either I would act or I would be discovered. The thought terrified me, but it also forced clarity. I realized then that dangerous hope was better than safe despair. For despair had nearly killed me, but hope, even dangerous hope, kept me alive. And so I clung to it, even as the risk grew greater with each passing day. I whispered once more in prayer, "Lord, I do not know when the moment will come, but when it does, make me ready." My hands trembled as I prayed, but my heart beat stronger. For the first time in 10 years, I did not feel only like a slave. I felt like a woman preparing to be free. The night I escaped was not planned in the way one imagines. There were no marked dates on calendars, no clear strategy written on paper. My escape was a prayer whispered for years, finally answered in a single fragile moment when everything aligned. The day had been like countless others. From morning until night, I labored at his command. My back ached from scrubbing, my hands raw from endless washing, my spirit heavy from the venom of his words. But that evening, as I cleared the dishes from the table, I noticed something different. He was careless. He had grown so certain of his control that he no longer watched me as closely. Arrogance had blinded him, and in that blindness, God opened a door. When he left the house for the night, muttering about seeing a friend, I knew the moment had come. My heart pounded as though it would burst from my chest. I froze at first, unable to move, gripped by the fear that had kept me captive for so long. His voice echoed in my mind, "If you ever try to leave, you will regret it." But then another voice, softer yet stronger, rose within me. "Whom the sun sets free is free indeed." I rushed to my room, where I had hidden the few coins I had saved. My hands shook as I tucked them into the folds of my dress. I grabbed the Bible that had absorbed my tears for years, pressing it to my chest like armor. I did not take clothes, nor food, nor possessions. None of those mattered. I wanted only freedom, only the chance to breathe without chains. Every step toward the door felt like walking through fire. My legs trembled, my breath shallow. I expected at any moment to hear his voice behind me, to feel his hand seize my arm. The house seemed to groan with each step, as if warning me that I was defying the master who had ruled it for so long. I paused at the threshold, my hand on the knob, whispering a final prayer. "Lord, if this is the night, let my feet not falter." And then I opened the door. The cool night air rushed against my face, carrying the scent of damp earth and distant pine. I had not felt such air in years, not as a free woman, not without fear breathing down my neck. My eyes filled with tears as I stepped into the darkness. The stars overhead seemed brighter than I had ever seen them. I whispered, "Thank you," and hurried down the path. Each step was agony and relief woven together. My ears strained for the sound of his return. Shadows stretched long and threatening, and every creak of the earth beneath my shoes felt like thunder. Yet I did not stop. I clutched my Bible tighter and kept walking. I did not know where I was going, only that I had to keep moving. My feet carried me toward the parish at the edge of town, the place that had once felt like sanctuary. My lungs burned, my legs screamed, but I pressed on, driven by the desperate hope that someone, anyone, would believe me. At last, the church came into view, its small steeple outlined against the moonlight. I stumbled up the steps, my body trembling so violently I thought I might collapse before reaching the door. With the last of my strength, I pushed it open. The scent of candles and wood polish washed over me. I fell to my knees, clutching the pew for balance. "Help me," I whispered into the empty sanctuary. My voice cracked, but it was the first time I had spoken those words aloud in 10 years. The silence that followed was not oppressive, but holy. For the first time, I felt silence cradle me rather than crush me. A priest emerged from the rectory, startled by my presence. His eyes widened as he saw me, ragged, trembling, clutching my Bible like a lifeline. "Sister, are you hurt?" he asked. His voice was gentle, and those words alone undid me. I wept, my body shaking uncontrollably. He hurried to my side, helping me into a pew. Through sobs, the truth spilled out. Not the whole story, not yet, but enough. Enough for him to see that I had been living in torment. Enough for him to believe me. His eyes filled with sorrow, but also with resolve. He did not question, he did not doubt. He simply said, "You are safe now, safe." The word felt foreign on my tongue. Could I truly be safe? Could chains so deeply embedded in my soul be broken by a single night of courage? And yet, sitting there in that church, I felt something shift. The bars that had imprisoned me for so long were not just physical. They were spiritual, emotional, unseen. And for the first time, I felt them crack. That night, I was given a small room in the rectory to rest. The bed was plain, the blanket thin, but to me it felt like a palace. I lay there staring at the ceiling, unable to believe what had happened. My body still trembled with fear that he would storm in and drag me back. But my spirit whispered another truth. I had walked through the door. I had escaped. I knew the battle was far from over. The scars of those years would not vanish overnight. My son would not simply release his grip without consequence. But I had taken the first step, the step I had prayed for in secret for a decade. That step carried me from prison into the unknown, from silence into the possibility of voice, from despair into dangerous, blessed hope. And as I drifted into restless sleep, one verse echoed in my heart. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. That night, I believed it for the first time in 10 years. Freedom does not arrive wrapped in joy. It comes trembling, uncertain, burdened with questions you do not yet know how to answer. The night I walked out of my prison, I thought I would feel only relief. But what I carried instead was the heavy weight of freedom, too new, too fragile, too terrifying to trust. In the small room at the rectory, I woke with the first light of dawn pressing through the curtains. For a moment, I did not remember where I was. My body tensed, bracing for his voice, his footsteps, his commands. But all I heard was birdsong, sweet and unthreatening. Tears slid down my cheeks before I even rose from bed. I had been free for only a few hours, yet my body still belonged to fear. The priest brought me bread and water, speaking gently as one might to a wounded bird. His kindness felt overwhelming. I had grown so accustomed to cruelty that mercy seemed alien. I wanted to trust him, to let my story spill out, but the words stuck in my throat. Years of silence had not loosened overnight. Still, I managed fragments, whispers of mistreatment, hints of the torment I had endured. His eyes softened, but he did not press me further. "You are safe here," he repeated. That phrase became a refrain, one I repeated to myself as though rehearsing a new language. "You are safe here." But safety did not silence the voices in my head. Guilt struck hardest. I asked myself over and over, what kind of mother escapes her own son? What kind of mother leaves him behind? The shame was suffocating. Though he had enslaved me, humiliated me, broken me, I still loved him with a mother's love. Love does not vanish, even when it is poisoned. That was perhaps the cruelest part of all. The days that followed were strange. My hands twitched for work, as though they did not know how to rest. I found myself rising early, scrubbing the floor of the small room, folding the blanket with precision, polishing the wood until it gleamed. The priest noticed and said gently, "You do not need to labor here. Rest." But I did not know how. Rest felt unnatural, even sinful, after so many years of forced servitude. In those early days of freedom, I battled voices within me louder than any command my son had spoken. One whispered, "You are nothing without him." Another hissed, "You will never be believed. You will always be a servant." And always, beneath them, the question that haunted me, "Who am I now?" I began to consider the convent. For years I had looked at the sisters with a kind of distant reverence. Their calm steps, their serene expressions, their devotion, it had seemed unreachable to me. But now, in the wreckage of my old life, the convent appeared not as something distant, but as a refuge, perhaps even a calling. I wondered if vows of service to God could redeem the years I had spent in chains to my son. I wondered if obedience freely chosen might heal the wounds left by obedience forced upon me. Yet even that thought brought conflict. Would entering the convent mean abandoning my son forever? Though he had destroyed me, he was still my child. A mother's love is a paradox, both anchor and shackle. My prayers in those days were tangled with sorrow. Lord, how do I love him without letting him destroy me? How do I forgive without returning to slavery? How do I heal without forgetting who he was to me? Freedom also brought suspicion. I dreaded that he would come for me, that he would storm the rectory demanding my return. Each sound outside made me flinch. Every knock at the door set my heart racing. The priest reassured me again and again, but trust was not something I could slip into like a fresh garment. Trust had to be rebuilt thread by thread. Still, there were glimmers of light. I remember one morning standing outside, the sun warm on my face. For the first time in 10 years, I breathed without permission. No one commanded me. No one watched me. The air tasted sweeter than I remembered. I closed my eyes and whispered, "Thank you." That moment was small, yet it felt like a resurrection. Over time, I began to tell more of my story to the priest. My words were halting, often broken by sobs, but each confession lifted a stone from my chest. He listened without judgment, without disbelief. His patience was a balm to my shattered trust. Slowly, I began to believe that perhaps God had not abandoned me after all. The weight of freedom remained, but it shifted. No longer a crushing burden, it became something I learned to carry, like a cross that also bore hope. Each day I took one trembling step into a life I could not yet fully envision. I did not know where the path would lead, whether to the convent, to a life of quiet service, or to some other calling. But I knew one thing with certainty. I would never again return to the prison of silence. Freedom was frightening, yes. It was heavy with guilt, shame, and uncertainty. But it was also the first gift I had received in years. And though I stumbled under its weight, I held it tightly, knowing it was mine to keep. In those days, I repeated one prayer more than any other. Lord, teach me how to live free. When I look back on those 10 years of torment, I sometimes wonder how I survived. My body bore the bruises of endless labor, my spirit carried scars that no one could see, and my heart was nearly consumed by silence. And yet, here I stand, no longer a slave to my son, but a servant of God, no longer hidden in shadows, but walking in the light of grace. My journey from wounds to healing was not sudden. It was slow, like the breaking of dawn, each ray of light pushing back the night inch by inch. After escaping, I remained at the rectory for some time, piecing together fragments of myself. The priest guided me with patience, reminding me that I was not defined by what I had endured, but by the strength it took to endure it. He helped me see that survival itself was not shameful, it was courageous. That truth began to settle in my bones. The thought of the convent returned often in my prayers. At first it frightened me. To give my life to God so fully felt like another kind of captivity. But slowly I realized it was not bondage, it was freedom. Unlike my years with my son, this would be obedience chosen, love freely offered, service rooted not in fear, but in devotion. The contrast struck me deeply. What had once been forced servitude could be redeemed into holy surrender. I still wrestled with guilt. How could I dedicate myself to God while leaving my son behind in his cruelty? How could I call myself faithful when I had failed so completely as a mother? These questions pressed on me heavily, but one evening, as I prayed in the dim light of the chapel, I heard a truth whispered in my soul. You are not abandoning him, by healing yourself. You cannot save him by destroying yourself. Those words brought tears of release. For the first time, I gave myself permission to let go. My path to the convent was paved not with certainty but with trust. I entered quietly, clothed in plain garments, carrying only my Bible and the scars of my past. The sisters welcomed me without question, their smiles warm, their voices gentle. In their presence, I felt what I had not felt in years, acceptance without condition. They did not see me as broken but as whole, not as victim but as survivor. Life within the convent was not easy, but it was sacred. My days were filled with prayer, service, and silence, not the silence of fear, but the silence of peace. I scrubbed floors again, but now each stroke of the brush was an offering to God, not a command from cruelty. I cooked meals again, but now the food nourished others in love, not a tyrant in arrogance. I labored, yes, but the labor healed rather than harmed. There were nights when the past returned in dreams. I woke sweating, trembling, hearing echoes of his voice. But in those moments I turned to the crucifix above my bed and whispered, "I am free now." And slowly, the nightmares lost their power. My scars did not vanish, but they no longer defined me. Instead, they became part of my testimony. Over time, I began to share my story with others. At first, only in fragments, spoken in hushed tones. Then, more fully, to women who arrived at the convent seeking refuge from their own trials. They looked at me with wide eyes, surprised that someone dressed in holy garments could have known such suffering. I told them what I tell you now: pain does not disqualify us from grace. On the contrary, it becomes the very place where grace works most powerfully. Some ask me if I ever forgave my son. Forgiveness is not a single act, but a journey. At first, I could not even imagine it. The wounds were too raw. But as years passed, forgiveness became less about him and more about freeing myself. Hatred is its own prison, and I refused to remain locked within it. I chose to forgive, not to excuse, not to forget, but to release myself from the chains of bitterness. Whether he ever changes is not mine to control. What is mine is the freedom of a heart unshackled by vengeance. Today, when I walk through the convent garden, I see beauty I once thought lost to me. Roses bloom, the air carries the sound of birds, the chapel bells ring out across the fields. Each sight, each sound reminds me that life can begin again, even after years of silence. I am not the woman I was. I am not the slave I once became. I am Sister Charlotte Reeves, and my life is testimony to the truth that wounds can be transformed into wells of grace. If you are listening to my story, know this: silence may seem safe, but it corrodes the soul. Speak even if your voice trembles. Hope, even if hope feels dangerous. Pray even if heaven feels far away, for there is a God who hears, a God who sees, and a God who delivers. I am living proof of that truth. My story began with chains, but it does not end with them. It ends with freedom. It ends with faith. It ends with the quiet strength of a woman who chose life over despair, hope over fear, God over bondage. And if my voice reaches you, let it carry this final message: you too are not forgotten. You too can find grace. I carried wounds for 10 years, but now I carry grace for eternity. That is my testimony. That is my freedom. That is my gift.